Hello, and welcome to APA's webinar on federal autonomous vehicle legislation. This resource is available to you as a member of APA's Planners Advocacy Network. Thank you for your advocacy on behalf of good planning and great communities. I'm Jason Jordan, APA's Director of Policy. I'll be discussing the status, content, and possible future of federal autonomous vehicle action and legislation. Let's start by taking a look at the most recent activity in the status of two pieces of legislation related to AVs. The first is H.R. 3388, also known as the Self-Drive Act. This is the House version of autonomous vehicle legislation. It's the first AV bill ever to pass a full House of Congress. It received voice vote approval in the Energy and Commerce Committee and ultimately similar treatment by the full House of Representatives. So very broad bipartisan consensus in the House of Representatives on this legislation, and it passed fairly quickly through that chamber. The Senate version of the legislation is similar, but we're going to talk about some of the differences between the two bills, is S. 1885, known as the AV START Act. It has been approved by the Senate Commerce Committee, but it has not yet gone to the full Senate for floor action, although that is anticipated. More debate and negotiation were present in the Senate's conversation about this legislation as opposed to the House bill, and in part some of that debate, some of that negotiation came about as a result of the House moving forward on their bill. So we have two similar pieces of legislation that are moving forward in the process, and we'll see how those bills are ultimately reconciled and resolved as the process moves forward. As I mentioned, we're going to spend a few minutes here today talking about the similarities and differences between those two bills. Let me begin by just highlighting some of the key issues that are involved here in terms of why the federal government and Congress is taking up this issue of autonomous vehicles, and what are some of the issues that are driving the individual pieces of legislation that we're going to talk about. I think the most prominent and most important in many respects is the issue of preemption. A lot of states have begun to take action, independent action, on autonomous vehicles and regulate them in various ways. And there was concern of a potential patchwork of differing regulations that would inhibit the ultimate implementation of AVs. So Congress decided to exercise their authority under the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution and begin to address this with federal action. They are also responding to the fact that US DOT has already been moving forward, dating back to the Obama administration, with a regulatory process related to autonomous vehicles, and there was a desire to lay out the pathwork and the desired areas of action for future regulatory actions at US DOT. Thirdly, there was a recognition that in states and communities across the country, there's beginning to be experimentation with pilot implementation of AVs, and that there needed to be some set of standard exemptions provided from existing automotive safety standards, which dictate virtually all kind of key features of automobiles, not all of which would necessarily be in place in an autonomous vehicle. So the legislation was intended to map out how that exemption process would look and over what period of time. There's also been concern and interest expressed in issues related to data and cybersecurity in terms of what might be provided to communities, what would be required of companies as they begin to move from in-house testing to actually putting vehicles in communities. Obviously, there are a lot of research issues that continue to be prevalent around this topic, and there's a clear interest on Capitol Hill in trying to drive some of that research in specific directions and also figure out what sort of advice US DOT and the Congress itself may need as AVs become more prevalent. And lastly, there's a significant issue, and we'll explore this more when we talk about the legislation in just a moment, about whether or not this initial phase of exemptions and AV implementation should cover cars only, as passenger vehicles, or whether it should be expanded in this initial phase to cover freight and trucking, which was a big flashpoint of the debate over the two pieces of legislation we're going to discuss today. So I mentioned the issue of preemption and the relative responsibilities at different levels of government, what's going to be left to the local governments to decide versus state governments versus a federal responsibility. This chart just gives you a sense of the fact that states aren't waiting for Washington in terms of moving forward with their own approach to the implementation and the regulation of autonomous vehicles. The map here shows you that 22 different states have enacted some form of legislation, some quite strict, some very permissive, and a further 5 states have seen executive orders issued by the governor related to AV implementation in their states. So more than half of the country has already seen elected officials, governors and state legislatures begin to wade into this area, and really it is the idea that states were moving so quickly in grappling with these regulatory issues related to AV implementation that drove congressional action this year, or is driving congressional action this year as the bills move forward. So let's talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between the two pieces of legislation. So what you'll see over the charts coming up here over the next few slides is some the major issue areas and how the House and Senate bills treat those areas. So we're going to start with an issue that I mentioned has really been most prevalent in some respects, the issue of preemption and the responsibilities of different level of governments. So both the House bill and the Senate Commerce Committee bill would make the federal government responsible for regulating the design, construction, and performance of autonomous vehicles. Neither bill, neither the House nor the Senate, would bar state or local governments from regulating the sale or repair of AVs. The House bill goes a little bit further and specifies some other functions such as licensing, insurance, and law enforcement that states could continue to regulate under their existing authority as long as they wouldn't impose unreasonable restrictions, that's a quote from the legislative language, on AVs. The Senate bill is a little less specific in this regard. It doesn't specify changes to states' current regulatory responsibilities. This issue of preemption in the legislation doesn't specifically address the role of local governments in areas like street design and other management of the transportation network, which is of course a key concern and interest of a lot of planners in this area of who's going to be responsible for what as autonomous vehicles move toward implementation. And some concerns have been raised in a number of advocacy organizations that the language in the House bill on unreasonable restriction could unintentionally perhaps impede the rightful role of local governments in managing some of those things. The Senate legislation, because it doesn't specify, essentially leaves a lot of those issues of responsibility of different levels of government as it relates to transportation and AV systems at the status quo, except for those areas that are specifically deemed off limits of design, construction, and performance of autonomous vehicles. So this legislation, neither bill, really gets into the specifics of how we're going to deal with things like urban design and management of street networks and the relationship to things like public transportation or sharing of vehicles and the like. That will be left for a later stage of policy making and implementation. I should note too that the Senate bill on preemption does contain language that licensing, which is left to the states, that can't discriminate against disabled operators of autonomous vehicles, and the disability community was very strong in their advocacy in this particular area. Let me talk a little bit about the rulemaking process. Obviously, that relates to the federal role in all of this. The House bill would direct the Department of Transportation to establish autonomous vehicle regulations. The Senate uses a similar but slightly different approach of more focused on a committee of stakeholders to recommend regulatory action. The Senate bill would also seek recommended changes to existing regulations from USDOT's Volpe National Transportation System Center, which consults with public and private organizations on transportation issues. And you can see on the slide that there are time limits and time guidelines, time frames really, around the rulemaking process set forward in both bills. But in general, the House bill defers more to DOT's existing process for developing regulations, and the Senate bill also acknowledges that but lays out a slightly more open process with committees and advisory panels playing more of a direct role. We'll talk a bit more about the state of the regulatory process for AVs at USDOT in just a minute. Let me shift now to this issue of the exemptions per manufacturer for AVs. This is a big part of the bill, as I mentioned before. And these exemptions are needed because AVs would not, by definition, comply with existing safety standards. So in order to put these vehicles out on the road for testing and preliminary implementation, some sort of exemption process would be needed, or those very detailed regulations would have to be completely overhauled with new sections related to autonomous vehicles. And the legislation anticipates that process going forward to update the regulations to address AVs, but provides these exemptions so that the process can move forward in the meantime while the regulatory scene is being sorted out by USDOT. Again, what you can see here on the screen are modest differences in the approach that the House and Senate versions take to both the volume of those exemptions and the timeline for those exemptions. The House also imposes some additional conditions in terms of exempt vehicles being listed in a publicly accessible database and mandatory DOT crash notification. The House is a little bit more aggressive in terms of the number of exemptions that would be issued across the 4 years of this exemption period that the legislation anticipates. On the issue of cybersecurity, both bills would require manufacturers to have cybersecurity policies. The House bill also requires manufacturers to have privacy policies. The Senate bill would establish a database describing how personally identifiable information collected by the vehicles would be used and secured and destroyed, and would also include manufacturers' privacy policies. The bills would require all passenger vehicles, not just autonomous ones, to alert the driver, to check for backseat occupants when they turn off the engine, and a few other provisions. One issue that's not directly addressed in either the House or Senate bill, which is of interest to a number of local governments and state DOTs and MPOs, is the provision of data to government, state and local regional government bodies who conduct transportation planning or other sorts of transportation safety related responsibilities, other sort of infrastructure responsibilities. There's work that's ongoing now to develop some proposed language around what data sharing provisions might look like in terms of prescriptive policy, so that planners and others working at the local level on implementation would have access to some of the information on how the system is being used, so that they can plan more effectively. Both pieces of legislation address the idea of advisory boards and councils to help set the regulatory framework and to advise U.S. DOT on a range of issues. The House bill creates a council that would address a range of safety and policy issues. The Senate bill is a little more specific, with language that was added for advisory committees specifically on consumer education and data access. The Senate bill also, when the bill was moving through committee, there was an amendment offered and ultimately accepted that would require further study on a range of important planning considerations as we think about a future with AVs on the road, to look specifically at issues of congestion and mobility, environmental impacts, and energy impacts. So under the Senate legislation, there would be a little bit more specific focus on additional research and study addressing some of the planning related issues related to AVs. In terms of trucks, this was again an area that was somewhat contentious and is likely to continue to prove to be so because there are obvious worries about the implications for jobs in terms of folks who work in the freight and logistics industry. Neither bill, the House or the Senate, have provisions to allow trucks to be included in the exemption process that's anticipated. And there was a good deal of lobbying that went on to keep that exclusion for trucks in the legislation. When the bill moves to the Senate floor, it is likely that this issue may well come back because there are a number of senators, including senators on the committee at the time, who agreed to let the bill move forward but still wanted to address the issue of trucks later on in the legislative process. So that's certainly one to watch. Let me shift from Capitol Hill now to US DOT and just briefly provide an outline of where we've been over the last few years and months in terms of regulatory action and where we're likely to be headed in the near term. So the first AV guidance came in the latter stages of the Obama administration. Just recognizing that this AV world was coming at us much more quickly than some had anticipated, and the need to get some preliminary guidance. And guidance here is an important word because guidance is different than binding regulations on AVs. When the new administration came in and President Trump appointed Elaine Chao as Transportation Secretary, it became clear even from her confirmation hearings that autonomous vehicles were very high on her list of priorities for US DOT, and we've seen that reflected in early actions out of DOT, including guidance that was released in September of 2017 that essentially replaced that earlier Obama administration guidance, and the announcement very recently from the Secretary that 3.0 version of that guidance is already being worked on at DOT and is due for release sometime in 2018. So in the space of less than 2 years, we will have 3 different and iterative versions of AV guidance issued by US DOT, which I think gives a sense of that fact that it is a priority at the department, and that there's a lot of catch-up work that's needed to be done on the regulatory and guidance front. And I think we can expect more of that from US DOT, as well as additional work on the research side to support the development of that policy guidance out of DOT. So what's next? Well, the next stage in the process certainly would be a vote by the full Senate. The exact timing of that is always difficult to pinpoint, and there's even been some discussion as to whether or not that would be a standalone vote on the legislation as it's written, or whether it would be folded into a larger package and approved in that fashion, which is fairly typical for bills to move through the Senate. It's possible that could happen before the end of the year, although that really depends on how quickly the Senate is able to address 2 very difficult issues of tax reform and year-end deadlines on appropriations. So the more likely scenario, unless AVs manage to hitch a ride on a must-pass year-end bill, would be for some sort of floor action in early 2018. I do think as we move into a midterm election year that there's a real opportunity for for Congress to move on this because it is relatively non-controversial, although there are some issues that do divide the parties, and there's strong bipartisan support. So both the House and the Senate bill was drafted and introduced by a group of both Democrats and Republicans, so that there is that momentum, which I think will be important when we start having an election season that colors what Congress is able to do. So they are looking for that path to final Hill action. It could be conventional in terms of a Senate floor vote and then a conference committee to resolve differences, or it could be some other approach where it's tacked onto other legislation, and then the House is able to accept that as a compromise to allow the AV provisions to become law. We'll just have to wait and see. I mentioned before that we're expecting additional DOT guidance in 2018. And while all this is happening, of course, pilot implementation is beginning to roll out in places around the country, which again, that reality is a big driver for the policy making that we see happening at all levels of government. And there are some new issues that are out there that will need to be considered, even if they're not directly addressed in this specific legislation. I'll just mention a few of them. One is the fact that most of the anticipated AVs will be electric vehicles, and how those will be addressed in terms of EV infrastructure, certainly some of the revenue side implications, of vehicles that aren't paying gas tax will have to be addressed. And that issue of a changing revenue landscape is equally important. Thinking about the future of the gas tax, the future of other sorts of local government related, state government related revenue streams that would be potentially changed. Those models would be changed if AVs are fully implemented. Some infrastructure issues are also involved here in terms of the expectation that eventually a lot of the transportation infrastructure would be wired in a way that it would be connected to the vehicles, and they could communicate with one another, which has implications for a lot of standards for that infrastructure and funding streams to support it. Separate from the discussion in this webinar, there's other legislation addressing so-called smart cities technologies and the potential for new grant streams, federal grant streams that would support some of this smarter infrastructure development and implementation that may well be required for AVs to function at scale. And then a related issue is vehicle-to-vehicle communication, again, which is a critical part of allowing AVs to operate at scale, but also contains within it implications for telecommunications bandwidth issues, as well as a host of data and privacy concerns. So those are all issues not specifically on the table in the federal bills we have in front of us at the moment, but are certainly being discussed in the policy world around AVs and likely to need to be grappled with in future legislation and regulatory actions. Let me say a quick word about APA resources and policy development around this topic. It's an important issue for planners across the country, indeed around the world, and one that APA is taking seriously, with a lot of resources in the pipeline. To help guide this process, the APA Legislative and Policy Committee is working with the APA Board of Directors in the development of a set of policy principles to help policymakers understand some of the planning issues involved in the rollout of AVs. We're also undertaking an update next year in 2018 of our Surface Transportation Policy Guide, which will address all facets of surface transportation policy, but will contain a special section that goes into more detail on a lot of the issues mentioned in today's webinar, to lay out our policy views and ideas for policymakers in the context of that policy guide. APA collaborated with a number of organizations on a symposium in October, bringing together a lot of folks from the world of local government, as well as academia and industry, to talk about the future of autonomous vehicles, and specifically to begin identifying things that local governments, local planners can begin doing to prepare for autonomous vehicles in their communities. And the goal of that symposium will be the release later this year or early in 2018 of a set of best practices and good ideas and fresh ideas, really, for local governments as they contemplate AVs. We will have some additional web-based resources that are released in our AV knowledge base, and these will all be gathered for you on a new section of the APA website that'll be specifically devoted to AV resources. And naturally, all of our educational programming at things like the National Planning Conference and the Policy Conference will continue to provide venues for understanding what's happening around the country on this important and emerging planning topic. If you have questions or want more information on what's happening in Washington as it relates to AVs or other transportation issues, you can always contact us via email, govtaffairs@planning.org. You can contact me directly, jjordan@planning.org. Certainly follow us on Twitter at APA Advocacy to stay on top of all the latest developments in Washington on this and other important issues. And of course, as a member of the Planners Advocacy Network, you'll already be receiving a lot of regular communications and resources to support your advocacy on behalf of great planning. Thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, and we look forward to welcoming you to future installments looking at important federal legislative and regulatory activities that affect the nation's communities. Again, I'm Jason Jordan, and thank you for joining us.